Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Happy to be joined again today we'll be a little more formal today, by Dr. Joshua Blank, Research Director of the Texas Politics Project.
Well, thank you. It's taken years for me not to cringe when people say that.
Yeah, well, it'll probably take years more before you stop based on my experience, but, We thought we'd talk today about a very specific storyline in the gubernatorial race in Texas that's been getting a lot of attention in the national press over the last week or two, and that's Beto O'Rourke's expenditure of time and effort in rural areas of Texas where Republicans are pretty much ruling the roost. He spent a lot of time in small cities and towns and counties where Republicans dominate elections. Not the first time he's tried this tactic.
Right.
Got a lot of press coverage in 2018 and
visited
for his 254 county strategy, in which had people a little bit scratching their heads at that, in 2018 around. So we're kind of revisiting something that we've seen before. And I thought it was interesting that he's doing this again. And, just in terms of the warm-up, I mean, the big question here, not to be, too indirect, is your O'Rourke campaign wasting time seeking a small number of long-shot votes? That's the rap in the state's least populated and most reliably Republican counties, at the expense, presumably, of drumming up Democratic base turnout in Democratic-heavy and hotly contested Democratic-heavy cities and hotly contested suburbs, where the Democrats have made demonstrable inroads in recent years, and just from sheer population point of view, where the votes are.
Right.
Now, so we're going to kind of drill into this, and we want to keep that question in mind, but we're going to try to dig up some stuff. I should warn people, even more so than usual, we're going to try to avoid drowning too much, and this will be a number-heavy podcast. But to start, there are a lot of vagaries and definitions here, and a lot of vagaries in the data that, we should try to at least get out there ahead of time. First one, like you brought up a lot, and we came across this in some projects we've done, is, what is rural?
Well, exactly, right. And the thing is historically, from the perspective of analyzing data, whether you're talking about like the Census Bureau or the government, and I mean, honestly, if you actually go, and I'll tell you right now, if you search Texas definitions rural, there's actually a document that's floating around out there from the legislature at one point that gives 25 different definitions of rurality and statute in Texas. So there's all, so needless to say, there's not a one definition. Some people say it's a state of mind, or whatever.
Right.
But the thing is that actually, as far as like from a scientific, I'm putting quotes up, air quotes now, guys, from a scientific perspective,
science,
generally speaking, what rural has been is not urban. So,
right.
so most cases is that most of the time the government has been trying to figure out how to deal with population densities and economic flows and things like that. And so really it's about, the level of urbanicity of a place, and whether that's solely based on population density or other factors. And there's things that come up like,
the big one that could like distance from a
right. Well, that's the thing. I mean,
certain level of density.
Well, one of the things, it can't just be density because, even very dense places like have airports, for example, and they have these parts that aren't dense. And so for classifying things, this is just it actually turns out to be somewhat difficult. Anyway.
And rural areas have prisons.
So, and that's the other thing too. Economic flows are very important. So, sometimes depending on why you care about it, you might say, hey, this area is clearly rural, but because like the economic interests of this area are tied to a city, let's say that's 30 minutes in, and most of the people are working, let's say in that area, for certain definitions, then you wouldn't count that as rural as opposed to a place whose economic output is totally like enclosed, but also very sparsely populated. So anyway, blah, blah, blah. I think, practically, what this means, and just as the real point here, is that when we're reading stories about Beto O'Rourke is in rural Texas, or even analyses trying to sort of purport to show, like we're going to kind of do a little bit of the opportunities and costs of like looking at these different areas. One thing to point out is like that might not be using the same definition of rural.
Right.
And one example of this that you brought up when we were looking into this is you look at the exit polling data. And for example, one set of exit polling, and what's interesting about exit polling data, besides the fact that it's very variable and has very large margins of error, is the fact that, what you get to do is you get to look at what the, both what the distribution is of the vote in different areas among different groups, races, ethnicities, obviously rural, non-rural, but then you also get to see what percentage of the state vote they estimate coming from those groups, which is useful. But when you go and look at this question, we find I think in one set of, exit polls, the rural and small town, as they put it, part of the state is 30% of the vote. In another set of exit polls, the rural composition or the rural contribution of the vote is about 13%.
Right.
Well, obviously it's not, it's got to be somewhere in there probably, but it raises this issue of the fact that just for, I think, everybody to be careful with is when somebody says rural, it's not going to always mean the same thing. And so just when we start talking about some of the electoral data that we looked at, just to be upfront with what I'm using the definitions of counties because they're fixed, used by Wayne Thorburn in his analysis of,
right.
Sort of electoral changes in Texas. Is this perfect? No, partially because it's constantly, Texas has been growing a lot.
Right. And we should fill out that citation for our readers. Wayne is a former Republican, he's retired Republican operative now. I think he's retired, but he wrote a book called Red State several years ago. It's terrific book.
Well, he has a new book out now too, actually.
Okay,
I think
good.
it's just coming out recently. So he's active, and I just use that as one possibility. But the point is, you could do other ones. So anyway, okay. So we can elaborate that more if necessary, but let's move on, right?
Right. So we should also tell, we use polling data a lot too, and the polling data in our and most polls is kind of self-disclosed.
Right. So we usually
exurban kind of falls out.
Yeah, we tend to have people tell us whether they live in an urban, suburban, or rural area, and we take them at their word for it. And I think, I'm pretty comfortable with that for the most part for lots of reasons, but it's not important. We could go into we could just talk about definition of reality forever, so let's not do it.
Yeah.
Let's get back to this.
This is just caveats, not a methodological pollcast. So, the political math here, I think you elaborate that a little bit. If you consider the most general campaign arithmetic,
right,
makes sense to think that O'Rourke needs to find some more votes beyond the pool of reliable Democrats who overwhelmingly support him.
Right, and I think that's the first thing from the data just to take out of this, which is, looking at the polling data. I mean, Greg Abbott is a known quantity. Beto O'Rourke, to a large extent, is a known quantity at this point.
Yeah.
Republicans are lining up behind Greg Abbett, in the numbers we would expect them to. Democrats are lining up behind Beto O'Rourke in the numbers that we would expect them to.
Right. When we've done trial ballots, and I think most other polling has found this too, the crossover voting and the gubernatorial, preferences right now is in the low single digits.
Exactly. And so, you consider that. You consider we talk about negative partisanship. And ultimately, I think to just bring this point back around is just to say, if, all the Democrats show up, who normally show up, and all the Republicans show up who normally show up, Republicans win races.
Right.
Full stop. So,
and that's been the fundamental problem that has framed elections in Texas now since the as the Republicans were becoming ascendant and became the consistent majority party, institutionally in 2003 after the 2002 election.
Okay, so then I guess in evaluating this sort of we'll call it the rural strategy, if you will, or something, which feels funny, but in evaluating it, I think, if you listen to this podcast, I like to give people the benefit of the doubt. As you know, I like to think that generally speaking, I like to ask when I see something, why would they be doing this if they knew what they were doing? And then we can kind of pick it apart.
Right,
I think it's really easy to kind of go in and just say, oh, well,
what's the argument?
What's the argument? Yeah, exactly. And so I was thinking about, let's look at this argument from a couple different points of view. And the first is you might say, look, maybe, O'Rourke, being the fact that he's a known quantity now, being that, he is the Democratic star in Texas without really a peer, at this point, he's almost universally known among Democrats and he's continuing to raise money. Maybe he doesn't need to spend as much time in those urban and suburban centers ginning up support. And there's actually some evidence in the data that he might not. And so I went back and I looked at some of our polling data on job approval numbers for Ted Cruz in June of 2018 to compare it to Greg Abbott's numbers in June of 2022. So at the same point in the election cycle, right? And what sort of was surprising, I think, is that even though Cruz is considered in that election, one of the factors that led to that close race, and there are a couple, I think that we could, you could lay out, but one of the
contextual.
There's a lot of contextual factors. But one of the factors that I think, people pointed to in terms of O'Rourke coming close to Cruz, and certainly his competitiveness in terms of raising money and all that stuff, was the fact that, Democrats really did not like Ted Cruz.
Yeah, Cruz was the Republican that Democrats love to hate.
Yeah, he's the arch nemesis. And also, he's a Republican that a lot of commentators kind of didn't really like, And so you see, ultimately this idea was, well, he's, especially, disliked. Having said that, though, when you go and you look at these two sets of numbers, what you find is that in June of 2018, 74% of Democrats disapproved of the job Cruz was doing. For Abbott, it's 86%. 79% of Democrats strongly disapprove of the job Abbott is doing. That's 5 points more than disapproved of the job Cruz was doing in 2018. Among independents, disapproval for Cruz was 43%, which is also a big part of that race, was the fact that independents broke probably for O'Rourke. Right now, in June of 22, 55% disapprove of Abbott. So that's a 12-point increase. Among urban voters, it's relatively similar to among both of them. Abbott's doing worse among suburban voters. Cruz was at 41 approved, 41 approved, 41 disapprove. Abbott's at 41-48. The only group that he's actually doing a little bit better with is actually rural voters, which is just a little. But ultimately, it's sort of it's interesting. So one thing you might say from looking at this is, given that Greg Abbott is as disliked by Democrats as really almost any kind of nationally big, well-known politician, it might not necessarily be the case that O'Rourke needs to put in the same level of effort to turn these voters out, would be one argument one could make, right?
Right.
Especially given the fact that, again, the only place where Abbott's looking to be slightly better positioned than Cruz is actually with rural voters, where Cruz wiped the floor with O'Rourke.
And this speaks to an interest. I mean, I think that speaks to an interesting overall dynamic that is being mulled out there and that we've mulled in here, which is, despite what had been, and this national conversation changed as of last night and today a little bit.
Yeah.
I don't want to get too into it, but, we've been thinking this was going to be a very, good Republican cycle. And yet it's been a very tough year for Greg Abbott, or a tough 6 or 8 months for Greg Abbott, depending on when you want to start. But certainly, as we've said on here before, going back to the power outages in 2021,
right?
Then the Uvalde shootings, abortion, a lot of the things that seem to be like, sign, a lot of the wind in the sails of the Republicans in Texas have kind of begun to blow the other way a little bit. So,
well, it almost seems like,
that's out there too.
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, I think part of it isn't, you didn't add this, but it's in there, but also, the extremity of the legislative session in between those, right?
Right.
And so, a lot of political capital was expended almost in some ways with, I think, a reasonable expectation that there was a lot to expend and a lot of slack in the sails. And so we should say, I mean, look, real quick, in 2018, O'Rourke also had Trump as a mobilizing influence in addition to Cruz, and obviously your point out, 22 is probably going to have its own set of additional kind of mobilizers, whether abortion or guns or something going on at the border. And, I'd also say in 2022, O'Rourke's not the shiny new object he was in 2018. He certainly has the damage he's taken on. You've got Biden, you've got the economy, you've got the border. But I think, if one thing, and I always say this, like, I like to see what campaigns do is a sort of a way that they reveal what they think. And to me, when I see, at least, and again, I want to be clear, it's not like O'Rourke isn't campaigning in the cities. It's not like he's not campaigning in the suburbs. Yeah. The reality is that, he spent a lot of time out in rural Texas in the summer.
Yeah, and they've just announced another leg of the tour that is going to be a little more balanced.
And it's going to be more balanced towards cities and suburbs.
That's what I mean.
So about a third is probably going to be.
This is not the fall tour is not a rural tour.
Right, and the fall tour is really like, this is kind of when like
late summer leg of the tour.
The campaign happens. So I think we should be clear about this, but I think at the very least it probably shows the O'Rourke campaign feels at least somewhat confident that it can, win the non-rural counties, which he did in 2018, and Biden did in 2020, but Hager didn't.
Right.
Against Cornyn.
MJ
Hager. Nor did Lupe Valdez in 2018, nor did Hillary Clinton in 16, nor Davis in 14. So it's not a guarantee that he's going to win, the non-rural counties as I'm describing it. But I think what the strategy has to assume is that, if O'Rourke can win the non-rural counties slightly, let's say 52-48, which is about where he was with Cruz, it recognizes that
the non-rural counties.
Sorry, the non-rural counties.
Yeah.
Sorry.
You said that, but I just want to... No. You said it right, but I just want to really... Yeah. We're talking fast. I want to underline the non-rural counties.
So it assumes that O'Rourke is going to win the non-rural counties, 52-48, something like that. But it recognizes that he also can't do that and then lose the rural counties 75-25, which has basically been kind of the split out there, right?
Right. Which elaborates kind of where we started, which is, you need something else. Mm-hmm. The O'Rourke campaign needs a little something else, unless you're going to assume the thing I'd like to think Democrats have learned, that they can't just assert.
Right.
or assume, which is a big increase in Democratic turnout that comes from
whatever they think the thing is this time.
yes. Some, yes.
Some combination of pixie dust.
Yeah, some magic god, whatever it's attributed
Well, it's
to.
not God.
So, but it's interesting. I mean, once, we kind of go through all that and then we get, and I got in my notes, I've got it, bolded. The only place where Abbott looks to be in a slightly better position is with rural voters, and that actually could fuel the argument for either side, whether either they shouldn't be doing this or they should, right? I mean, depending
absolutely.
on what you think the potential for changing views is. I mean, I'm struck as we look at that data that, well, Abbott is in, worse shape slightly in all of those areas, than in 2022 than Cruz was in 2018. The only one of those that's kind of really clearly outside the margin of those subgroups is among independents. And as you were saying before the podcast, we land once again on independents, and there aren't that many independents anywhere, but there aren't that many in, the rural areas of Texas are not more independent, are not more subject to, being, having independence there than are the rest of the state.
I think, if anybody starts telling you that they're certain what rural independents think, I think you need to grab your wallet. Just wait a second.
Some, as we say, pretty small cells.
Pretty small cells, most likely. So, but this raises this question overall, which is just to say, okay, so you're looking for more votes in rural Texas. Well, does that make sense? I mean, let's flip the argument and go, let's talk about rural Texas for a second, right? And so one thing we can do is we can look at sort of the rural contribution to the state's overall vote totals, right? So how much of the vote does rural Texas contribute? And the one interesting thing, first and foremost, looking back, is that it's been declining. Yeah. So it went from, about 15.5% in 2014, and it's down to about 13.3% in 2022. Now, ultimately, you'd say, well, that's just a little bit, but ultimately in a place like Texas with millions and millions of voters, this does actually add up to some big numbers, even if the overall contribution is relatively small. Right. I think should also raise the point here, which is when people say hey, nobody lives there, and it's not true. It's not true that nobody lives there. Right. People live there. But when we're looking at the electorate, we're talking about a slice of the electorate, relative to most of the urban areas. Right.
And if you start doing that back of the envelope math, I mean, you start talking about moving 3 or 4 or 5% of 13%.
And we will.
Yeah.
Just two more, I guess, a couple more contextual things to know here for this audience, right? Turnout was slightly higher in rural counties than in non-rural counties in 2014. In 2016, 18, and 20, the non-rural counties have had a slightly higher turnout than the rural counties, but the gap is first of all, it's pretty consistent. The gap is relatively small. So 2018 had the biggest gap in turnout,
right?
And it was 2.63 points. So it's just a little bit more turnout in the urban counties, which again, it does add up to a lot of votes because it's a lot of people there. But ultimately, it's not as though there's a lot of wild fluctuation. So I think you kind of have a set feeling for how many voters are going to turn out. I think pretty clearly based on past performance. There's a lot more variability in the non-rural turnout because there's so many more people, and the numbers. I mean, basically the percent shifts turn into large numbers very quickly, and we kind of see that really quickly when we start to do some back of the envelope calculating. So the question then becomes, okay, it's a small share. What's the potential, right?
Right.
And this doesn't look great for O'Rourke, right? So we get a couple of different things we can look at, right? We can look at our polling, and we can look at election returns, for example. And so we ask people whether they live in urban, suburban, or rural environment. We've been doing this on every poll, going back to 2008.
Yeah.
I decided just to look back to February 2015, just for reasonable range of the modern era.
For the comparison of the two cycles, of the recent cycles. Yeah.
Right. And what we found is, on average, about 62% of rural voters identify as Republican, but no less than 64% since June of last year in 2021.
Right.
For Democrats, it's about a little under 26% on average, but it's been 22% in each of the last 4 surveys. So, close to 1 in 5 would identify as Democrat. And the Republican vote share has shifted between about 73.5% in the Trump-Clinton matchup to a little over 77% in Abbott's re-election over Valdez. The Democratic vote share has sort of fluctuated between about 22 and 25% of the vote.
Which also fits our, the evidence that we have a somewhat more Republican electorate in midterm election years.
Absolutely. Well, and I think it also, what you see here is something we talk about all the time, which is as you go from registered voters to likely voters to the actual electorate, you go from basically a 60-25 to a 75-25 electorate, right? We asked fave, unfave about O'Rourke, and this doesn't, in all of our polls recently, and when we look among rural voters, it doesn't really show a huge potential, to be honest, because his total favorability among rural voters seems to top out at about 25%, which is
right.
So
which interestingly, if we look at the exit polls,
kind of matches
pretty in the ballpark of what the baseline is,
right. So let's
allowing for all the stuff we started with, all the caveats we started with.
Okay, I'm going to wrap up the math.
Okay, good.
I promise. Then we'll go to sort of what do we take from this, right? So we like to do back of the envelope calculations from time to time.
We even have a graphic. Time to resurrect the graphic. You worked hard on that graphic. We might as well.
It's a nice because it's like a French airmail one, which
right.
it has its problems, but it's very clear what it is. Anyway.
Well, you can read the podcast while you're crunching on some crudité.
Exactly. Well, if you can afford it. So if we take the 2018 Senate race as sort of the point at which we're going to make a departure, which is a very generous, and I think that's fine. We're making a very generous, comparison point for O'Rourke because that was the closest Democrats have come. Cruz's margin of victory was about 215,000 votes. Overall, his rural margin of victory was almost 560,000. So just doing a little calculation, if Beto improved his standing among rural voters to, let's say, 30% from 24.93, which he got in that race, right, which would be a pretty big increase if you think 5%.
Percentage-wise.
5% of 25% is a lot. So he
right.
increases to 30%.
However.
So then he nets an additional 57,000 voters approximately. And we could let's make another generous assumption, right, which is that all of those voters came from Cruz. They were going to vote for Cruz. And, in this case, they would have been Abbott voters, but now they're going to be O'Rourke voters. So then Beto nets 114,000 votes. He's still 100,000 votes short of his margin.
Right.
So, all this has to assume, even just to sort of really get something meaningful out of this rural place, that he's going to have to run at least 5 points better than his favorability numbers, at least 5 to 8 points better than than party identification in these areas, which he might get a couple. No, I did a little back of the envelope math on this. He could get a couple points from independents.
Right.
But when I say a couple points, I mean a couple points, 1 or 2, right? And he's going to have to do about 5.
Again, that's not very many votes.
Yeah, and he's going to have to do about 5 points better than past Democratic results if he's going to try to cut his loss here, his deficit, in half. Now, obviously, this leaves out a million things, right? There's a lot of interlocking complexity here. What does turnout look like in urban, suburban, and rural parts of the state? How large is O'Rourke's advantage in the urban areas? Should he have one, especially in the suburban areas? This is where most people are. How did the state's suburban voters cast their ballots? What's the split with Hispanics?
And dare we even say rural Hispanics?
Right, and dare we say rural Hispanics? And then I would say, and then all of that I say, and how much cover does rural Texas provide Republicans?
Right.
So all those things are going to be related to each other, and so that's kind of where we land on this. So what are the takeaways?
Yeah, I think the O'Rourke campaign and O'Rourke and his campaign functionaries themselves, in a lot of the coverage that we saw, I think there were a couple of particularly good quotes in the Washington Post article. Apologies to the writer of that piece. I thought it was very well done that came out last weekend. It was well done in the sense there was none of these numbers in it, but it was very closely observed, and I thought a very good on-the-ground portrayal of what these events that O'Rourke is doing in these rural areas feels like. And I think that what the O'Rourke campaign was saying, what they were saying there is that this is not just about the math in the rural areas. It's about a larger communication of O'Rourke's image and potentially, as you've been pointing out, even perhaps a contrast with Abbott's persona in image right now. And I think in terms of the O'Rourke image, I think the idea is that it may help, it could help with turnout not only in the rural areas, but also in the non-rural areas in terms of, the bank shot you get from coverage and increases in enthusiasm.
Yeah, and I think it matches sort of, some of the demographic patterns in the state where, Texas, we already kind of mentioned the fact that the share of the vote coming from rural parts of the state has been, consistently, declining in small numbers, but considerably.
Yeah.
And that reflects, I think what's going on in Texas, which is going everywhere, which is that, sort of the urbanization of populations and people moving out of rural areas. But what this also needs to reflect is that, you do also have a lot of people living in and around the urban areas and the suburban areas that whose vote you want to get, who come from these rural parts of the state, right? And that's part of the sort of the bank shot. And this is very much kind of part of the brand that O'Rourke has put forward as being, not, I wouldn't say post-partisan in that, because I don't like that term and blah, blah, blah.
And I don't, and
it's not accurate.
And I think they're taking it pretty easy on that this time around.
No, they are taking it easy. But the idea that, he's willing to go and, talk to people, I think is, probably pretty important from just sort of a demonstration effect, right? I mean, if people feel like, the state is, if the goal of the campaign in some ways is to make this a referendum on Republican leadership and the fact that it's too focused on, sort of extreme minorities within the Republican Party, for O'Rourke to make a credible case that he's there to govern for everybody, he can't just go to Austin and Dallas and Houston and then say, no, I'm here for everybody. And this is a way to demonstrate that actually.
Well, and in a sense, I think you get two benefits that are in tension from that potentially. I mean, I think you get exactly what you're talking about. But you also get for younger urban voters, I mean, throughout this whole and Democratic suburbanites that are in many cases relatively new suburbanites, you get almost the opposite benefit. Throughout this whole conversation, I keep waiting to say something about negative partisanship.
Yeah.
But I think they can't say this. But I think when, Beto O'Rourke goes out and throws an MF at a guy harassing him or challenging him, we should say be a fair way, challenging him or, laughing at him in a rural campaign meeting, that I think a lot of his supporters like that, and a lot of young supporters they see it as, that's still a continuation of that combative, unorthodox, he's not one of, it's not even so much just he's one of us, he's not one of them elements.
Right.
That I think he benefits. And that's kind of, that plays out a little bit of what I was saying earlier, but I think it's probably a little bit of an underappreciated aspect of him campaigning in these areas that of course they can't, I mean, it's too conflicting with the message you were talking about to come out and say it, but I would be surprised if they didn't realize that they get some benefit from their base voters from him showing that he's willing to go out and fight.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, this is something I don't think many people are going to draw, sort of make this parallel, but someone who sits here and follows us so closely, and I don't think this is for voters, but it was striking reading, all this coverage about, so he's, O'Rourke's out there, sort of these groups of people are showing up with the intention of, essentially disrupting the campaign event, quote unquote, running him out of town or whatever. And then, you have these interactions where, people who are clearly hostile to his message, but also are, hurling threats and, insults at him. Well, I was going to get to, and who are physically armed, right? In most cases. And you've got these videos of, O'Rourke going up and, basically talking to them, right? And I mean, I'm sitting here and thinking to myself, and I'm reluctant to say this, but I'm just going to say anyway, about how long it took Greg Abbott to go back to Uvalde. And at the time we said this, and it's in recordings, so let's put this, the only read that we could kind of have of why he wouldn't do that is because he doesn't want to go and have video of grieving parents hurling insults at him, yelling at him,
or asking him questions he doesn't want to answer.
Right. And the contrast between those two things in the moment of, again, clearly hostile men with guns yelling, clear threats at you and him walking over and talking to them, and the fact that Abbott,
right.
It's, in terms of the contrast and styles, I mean, to me, that's one of those, and you're just like, ooh.
Okay. So let me ask you this. I mean, and I don't.
Yeah, sure.
I'm processing it myself, and I think I know what I think the answer is, but I don't know, or what my answer would be. What's the relative value of that in mobilization versus persuasion?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, to me, I think...
I think it probably has more mobilization value than persuasion value, but...
I think it's all mobile.
Again, it brings us back to, the pin. We're going to have to do the podcast. We're going to have to do the independent podcast pretty soon.
I think it's about mobilization, and I have two reasons why, more so than persuasion here. Number one, a main issue that I think we've talked about before is the fact that, in a lot of cases in many of these rural parts of the state, there is no Democratic Party really to speak of.
Right.
And so first and foremost, if you are a Democrat who lives in one of these counties in which, Republicans regularly get 70+% of the vote, and in many cases you don't even have a Democrat running for many of the offices, ultimately without someone like Beto O'Rourke coming out there and kind of ginning something up, you are going to have mobilization problems because ultimately the vote does not count. I mean, it's not going to make, that doesn't count. It doesn't make a difference is the way we think about it from political science. You're not going to impact the election locally because there's no election to impact locally in a lot of cases.
Yeah, outside of an expressive vote, you're not.
And so to some extent, I think there's a couple things going on, which is, one is Democrats have become more competitive in the urban and suburban areas. It's less incumbent upon, someone like Beto O'Rourke coming to town to sort of gin up interest in this environment. And you have Democrats on the
And that
ground.
is where negative partisanship is. I mean, if you assume a degree
Right.
of negative partisanship in the urban and suburban areas, you probably don't have to push as hard to get people out.
Exactly. And you've got people there working and campaigning because they're actually running for office there. In these rural parts of the state, you don't really have that. And really the only Democratic campaign that's kind of going on in a lot of these places is Beto O'Rourke's and Mike Collier's. And so to some extent, there's a little bit of a distribution of responsibility here that I think actually is a little bit about mobilization. It does make sense. I think
so. I want to be able to, I just don't,
Yeah.
who knows who's listening, but, the only salient Democratic campaigns, right? I mean, I think a lot of these other down ballot guys are out, or candidates, Rochelle Garza and Jay Kleberg are out there a lot. I think they're working.
No, but
the salience is lower.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think something else that's sort of shifted a little bit, and this will kind of relate to the other reason I think it's about mobilization. And I don't know what you think about this. We've talked about this before, but I do wonder to what extent greater competition in South Texas districts that are still predominantly Democratic, but are going to have, more competition this cycle doesn't change the calculus a little bit. We've talked in the past about, how a lot of times Hispanic Democrats who are representing, majority Hispanic districts that vote overwhelmingly Democratic don't necessarily have, a big incentive to gin up turnout, right? And to really mobilize a bunch of voters. And I wonder if that calculus is changing a little bit, so for O'Rourke, maybe, there's less value to going to some of the more denser sort of, valley population centers as opposed to spending a little more time in some of these other counties where, again, there's less of an infrastructure, less going on.
Right.
And this is my last thing, then I'm done. The other thing about this, I think, is this is part of, in terms of, this is about mobilization. Ultimately, this is about narratives. I mean, because we're not talking about a lot of voters here. And we've talked before about, I think, how Republicans are really, pushing the narrative that they are making inroads among Hispanics. And we've really called into question exactly what does that mean? And really, for the most part, what that's meant that, Republicans are seeking out Hispanics, especially in rural, they're seeking out conservative Hispanics in rural parts of the state who generally would lean Republican anyway, but that Republicans have not been that interested in seeking out over the last 10, 20 years. To me, as I said before, that's a reflection of the fact that, they see a more competitive environment in which it's valuable to go out and find these people, especially when they know their Republican voters are going to turn out. You could flip that around and say the same thing about this. Democrats feel confident that Democrats are going to turn out even in a midterm cycle. And so really now, if the state's as competitive as it, needs to be, if O'Rourke is even going to have a chance of, even being close, well, now he's got to go and focus on these other voters and really kind of turning them out of the woodwork. And I think both campaigns are kind of saying the same thing with different versions of it. And both of them also have sort of this bank shot effect of saying for Republicans, hey, we are making inroads with the Hispanics. And for Democrats, O'Rourke say, hey, we're not just the party of the city.
Yeah.
Now, is that going to win? Is that going to work for him? Is it enough?
The takeaway, so then, where does that leave us and where does all this leave us? I mean, I think that people that are opposed to this, or that think that this strategy is not a good one, both Democrats and Republicans, to my mind, probably underestimate the degree to which this probably is a plausible part of the solution to the problem that Democrats have right now.
Yeah.
Which is there are just natural limits to their ability to increase turnout above the trend line, shall we call it, in the demonstrated going into this election of kind of the moving baseline of Democratic turnout. You got to have something else, in addition to the argument that this time we're going to really beat the Bushes, and part of that goes to something that we've said before that does speak to your the efforts and the thing about the Republican efforts on the Valley, which is there's always a Republican counter response to that.
Yeah.
Right, that is not to be underestimated. And Beto O'Rourke does have an advantage this time, that a lot of other campaigns, Democratic top-of-the-ballot campaigns, have not had in the past, which is he has a lot of resources. And the opportunity costs of him spending time and resources in rural areas may not be as high as a lot of the common sense, the quote-unquote common sense arguments would suggest.
Yeah, I mean, to go back to what you were saying about, it's not like Rochelle Garza, and Jay Kleberg aren't, campaigning in these places. But the reality is that they're not known to anybody. So for them, the cost of not focusing their efforts where the Democratic votes really are concentrated is a lot higher.
But also, which but another point to that, which you also is that, the O'Rourke campaign has the resources to have other, to be beating the Bushes in the suburbs.
Right.
and in their urban areas. And we'll see. I mean, one of the most conventional criticisms of O'Rourke in 2018, which has some fairness, is that they did not do enough media, they did not do enough television in the final, in the final weeks of the campaign, in the high campaign season after Labor Day. And I do suspect that's not going to be the case this time.
Yeah, and the other big criticism I think that they've clearly internalized from what I've read is that they didn't take the case to Cruz early enough. And part of this is to say there's something you brought up the sort of the viral moment with the MFer comment, and in some ways that actually when you said it, kind of sticking with me, because that is something that O'Rourke has had a preternatural ability to create viral moments for himself. But the reality is, in some ways, by going out, by going into these, going to these areas where you are going to have a certain amount of hostility, like, you may be just creating more viral moments. We've seen the Abbott campaign say, hey, don't wear your Abbott stuff and go to the event so they can take pictures of you and say you're converted. And so they're seeing something here that's a little bit of a,
And I guess what occurs to me is that, those viral moments, or even just the moments that seep into coverage and into his image, are a little bit more coherent overall.
Yeah.
And a little more so far tailored to the moment.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, think about all the conversations we had, including with friends of ours, about him riding the skateboard in the Whataburger. That was cool. It was viral.
Yeah.
A little bit of a wash in terms of impact on, perhaps, played to some young people, but other people thought it was kind of stupid and frivolous, right? It's a little more focused to have a bunch of moments where you are having the kind of exchanges with people in small towns that are arguing with O'Rourke about guns and about his positions, and it's been a pretty remarkably consistent feature, and this could be reporting bias towards conflict, but nonetheless, I think it's real, that one of the common things is people telling him, we don't want you around here, and him going, well, some people do, and I'm not going away. Right. That's a lot more focused and coherent with this combative image, again, cohering with negative partisanship, but also it's just a little more politically meaningful and a little more on point than I was in a punk rock band and I could skateboard, right? And I think there's something to that. So I guess where we land is, in and of itself, the numbers are not going to the numbers in the rural areas are not going to be enough. Right. But there may be some some externalities here and some other, what we've called bank shots that may be more helpful. And, I think, and so I think it will be dependent on what, of course, like everything, what the final phases of the campaign look like, and these things don't happen in a vacuum. And what the Abbott, counter move strategy is. We're getting now, it's getting to be late, mid to late August. We're getting close to, we're already seeing an uptick in tempo. We should mention, Greg Abbott put out his first TV ad in the last week, featured his wife prominently, a bio ad, basically. Yeah. Talked a lot about his personal experience. Well, I mean, I think, what's interesting is that it was, we haven't talked about that, and we don't have time to decompose it now. Maybe we'll come back and do a podcast on sort of what the media images are of both candidates, which we've kind of edged into. But I mean, look, front and center put his injury and his response to his injury, which was an interesting play. A couple of people I know that are inside of this were very quick to note that, I would say. So on that, we will do a post with a bunch of stuff on this. Some of the graphics will be a little, working versions. There's going to be some cutting and pasting here from some of our working stuff, which we've done before, but some of our also more polished graphics. So I want to thank Josh for being here, all the work you put into this. Thank as always, our crew in the audio studio and the Liberal Arts Development Studio at the University of Texas at Austin. Thanks to all you for listening. We'll be back soon enough with another Second Reading podcast. You can find the data here that we talked about on the Texas Politics Project website. That's texaspolitics.utexas.edu. Again, thanks for listening. We'll be back again soon. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.